So, you can start, Jerry.
Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. We'd love you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, the campaign wants to connect with you on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Moving from Trauma-Informed to Asset-Informed Care. My name is Sarah Torian, and I am a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and will be moderating today's conversation. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of quick housekeeping details. And actually, could we go back one slide, please, to the listing? There, that's great, thank you. So housekeeping details. First of all, I'd encourage you to introduce yourself. Let us know your name, organization, and the name of the GLR coalition that you're a member of. If you're a member of the GLR coalition, the chat box. This is new. Previously, there weren't options in terms of who you were sending your message to. I want to make sure you include 2 panelists and attendees when you introduce yourself so that we can all see who is in the room with us today. Secondly, wanted to let you know that all webinar attendees will be participating in listen-only mode, and that's to prevent any distractions or background noises during the presentations. But we do strongly encourage your active engagement throughout this conversation and encourage you to share any questions that might come to you during the presentations using the Q&A box, which is also on your Zoom screen. And again, this is a little bit different. Previously, we would post our questions in the chat box. We now have a Q&A box where we can post those, and it makes it easier for us to track them and make sure that none slip through the cracks in the chat box. So please look for that Q&A box. And then also, as you heard in the opening of the webinar, this webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered for the conversation will receive an email coming out next week that will include a link to that recording, along with the slide deck and any and all resources that are shared during today's conversation. So keep an eye out for that early next week. And then finally, I just wanted to give you a heads up that we will be posting a very brief survey poll after the presentations during the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I'd really encourage you to take just a couple of quick moments to share your thoughts and feedback through that poll. It really helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement and making sure that these conversations are informing your work and meeting your needs. Now I'd like to share just a little bit of background about GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got a number of great sessions planned for the coming weeks. Always on Tuesdays, always starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're hoping that that predictable and reliable schedule will make it easier for you and others to make plans to join in for more of these online learning events. Having now hosted 20 webinars since the start of GLR Learning Tuesdays last September, I would also encourage you to check out CLIP. That's the campaign's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, where you can find the growing archive of resources from these online learning conversations, exploring the best science, ideas, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. And then I also hope that you'll continue to save this date and time and make plans to join in for more of these online learning conversations. But now for today's learning conversation. There has been a growing awareness of the need to understand and mitigate exposure to traumatic experiences that are often precipitated and exacerbated by poverty. But the key question is, how do we do this work in ways that are rooted in children's and families' assets, and that recognize that even in the face of adversity, key positive experiences can help us heal? So to explore that question and to offer some guidance on how we can move systematically from trauma-informed to asset-informed care. I am very honored to introduce our two panelists for today. They are Ellen Galinsky and Dr. Robert Sege. Now, Ellen, for those of you who have participated in Science Matters webinars in the past, needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She is the Chief Science Officer of the Bezos Family Foundation, where she also serves as the Executive Director of Mind in the Making and remains the President of Families and Work Institute as well. Ellen's life work involves identifying important societal questions as they emerge, conducting research to seek answers, and turning the findings into action. She has conducted research on childcare, prenatal growth and development, on early learning, and on work and family life. Her career highlights include writing more than 100 books and reports, serving as a childcare expert in the TV series What Every Baby Knows with Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, serving as a parent expert on the Mr. Rogers Talks to Parents TV series, being elected president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and being elected as a member of the National Academy of Human Resources. Dr. Robert Sege is a professor of pediatrics and medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, where he directs the new Center for Community Engaged Medicine. Dr. Sege is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy in Washington, D.C., is part of the Leadership Action Team for Massachusetts Essentials for Childhood, and serves on the boards of Massachusetts Children's Trust and Prevent Child Abuse America. He received the 2019 Ray E. Heffler Award from the Alliance of Children's Trusts and the American Academy of Pediatrics. He has served on national committees for the American Academy of Pediatrics and has been lead author on several important AAP policies. His extensive speaking and publication list include contributions to the prevention and treatment of child maltreatment and youth violence. So welcome to you both, Ellen and Bob. And I would also just like to point out that after these presentations, we will hear from Sarah Welsh from the Iowa ACEs 360 Coalition, and she will share her comments and reflections on the presentations from the perspective of a GLR community that has been doing work around trauma and toxic stress. But Bob, I was wondering if we could start with you to get this conversation started. Can you share with us how experiences shape the brain and the implications of those experiences?
Absolutely, and it's really, thank you for inviting me, and it's really a pleasure to be here to talk with you a little bit about the language and science of hope. And hope stands for healthy outcomes from positive experiences. And before I go in any further, I want to just acknowledge my colleagues from around the country who have been involved with this. You can see really quite an all-star cast. Dr. Bethel from the Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Institute, Charlene Harper-Brown from CSSP, and you can read through the rest of the list. Also want to highlight Dina Burstein and Chloe Yang on my staff here at Tufts Medical Center, and funding from the Wisconsin Children's Trust, Casey Family Programs, JPB Foundation, RWJ HRSA, and from Tufts. So when I start talking about the language of hope, the way I'm going to talk about it is borrowing from Jeff Lincoln back in the Montana Institute, who developed the science of the positive. So we'll first start talking about spirit, then move into science, and then action. So when I talk about spirit, what I'm thinking about really is the unlimited human capacity for resilience and recovery. And we're going to go through some discussion later about that. But the most important thing to think about is that all of us have a variety of experiences, some of which are beneficial, some of which are harmful, but that really matter. But the other way to think about spirit is the spirit that drives us into our work. And so what I'd like you to do is go into the chat box, a word or two about whatever it is you're doing. There are easier ways to make a living, so go out there and say that right away. But something moves us to do it. So just write your responses in the chat box, and they'll scroll through as we talk. In a few minutes, Sarah will read through some of these. This is wonderful. I just want to share with you on the next slide some responses I got from a group in Minnesota when I asked them a similar question. And these were mostly home visitors who visited families of young parents and children. And I think that's very important. And the reason we talk about this is as we go through this, one of the ways that we connect with the work we do is by getting back to what inspires us and why we're here. And I'm hoping that by the end of today's conversation between myself and Ellen, we'll realize that this hopeful look at it, an asset-based look at it, ties back into why we came in the work in the first place. So this is delightful because I know, Sarah, we'll be able to keep these chat comments, right? So I want to go on and just do a really brief overview of trauma. And I'm sure many people here know about that, but we know that trauma affects brain development and health. And when I go through this, just remember that often the way we find out about the human body functions is by understanding what happens in disease and with problems. It doesn't mean that that's everything, but it's a way that it illustrates it. So in that spirit, one of the things we found out from trauma is that a child's experience has long-lasting effects on brain structure and function and health. Much of this information comes from the 1998 Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was done in Southern California among employed people who had their health care at an HMO that was an employer-sponsored HMO. Most of them were white, and this was published in the late 90s. They looked at 3 types of adverse childhood experiences: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. But given the population that was looked at and when it was done, it's important to remember that there are other community and societal factors that contribute to toxic stress, to the problems that children subsequently have. Those may be the direct effects of poverty, institutional racism, trauma, war and migration, and neighborhood effects. And Wendy Ellis, whose picture is in the upper right-hand corner at George Washington University, really elegantly described this as the adverse community events that are kind of underground and are the roots of the adverse childhood experiences. Poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, mobility, and social capital, poor housing, quality and affordability, and violence are all the underpinnings, the roots of adversity. But as the next slide shows, regardless of the causes of them, these have enormous health impacts in the United States. This study that was just published in November from the Center for Disease Control, led by Melissa Merrick, looked at how ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, contribute to the chronic diseases in the United States. The statistical technique is called the population attributable fraction. So if you look at it, and I'm going to go right to the right-hand column that looks overall, chronic heart disease, 1 in 8 cases of chronic heart disease in the United States can be attributed to ACEs. 1 in 4 cases of asthma, almost half of the cases of depression, the most prevalent mental illness, about 1 in 4, 23.9% of heavy drinkers, that drinking is attributed to ACEs. I know we're talking to an education audience, but look at this. Among people who are adults who didn't finish high school, 1 in 20 of them had 4 or more ACEs. This is a striking statistic and just shows the burden of disease. So from here, we get to the model that we now understand: adverse childhood experiences, those that were in the original study, and those adverse community experiences that Dr. Ellis described, puts a child at risk for toxic stress. And simply put, when we're stressed, our bodies produce stress hormones. So we've all felt this when we're angry and our faces turn red and our hearts beat. We have that fight or flight reaction. If that comes and it's transient, that's okay. However, if a child is in a chronic condition of stress, it causes changes in the way the brain develops, and these changes can lead to lifelong negative health outcomes like those I just showed you. So this is all by way of background because we're getting to the resilience in just a second, but I want to make sure we're all on the same playing field. And I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you for the work that you do. This is a thrilling opportunity for us to be together and to talk about this with all of you. About the time that people started to talk about ACEs and toxic stress and trauma-informed care, I was divided about how to respond. I should tell you a little bit about me. I'm from West Virginia, and my first job was working in West Virginia, and there were doing research on school dropouts and juvenile delinquents. And a team of researchers from around the country came into West Virginia to study people who were my friends and neighbors, people I'd grown up with and gone to school with. And when I would sit in the staff meetings and listen to them talk, I was horrified because people would just see the bad sides of the kind of poverty that we have in West Virginia, but not see the strengths and the good sides of people. And I knew that from having grown up there. So I'm come into this with a kind of a hypersensitivity to stereotyping and people seeing the negative sides of things that come from that job that I had. So when people began to talk about ACEs and trauma-informed care and toxic stress, I understood what a wonderful thing that it could do. It could help people understand that the children's behavior was influenced by the kinds of experiences they had. And if a child was acting out, it may not be that that child was just willful or bad or the things that people were assuming about them. It may be that that child was reacting to the stress in his or her life and had a fight or flight response. We were sharing the work on toxic stress in a seminar at one point, and the group in the seminar, this is when Mind in the Making just began, and the group in the seminar were asking about the difference between severe and normal and toxic stress. I'm sorry, the difference between positive and stress from tolerable to toxic stress. And at that point, a woman who was very much a leader in that community got very agitated. And she said, you know, when you're talking about toxic stress, you're not just talking about the children, you're talking about the families. And then she said, and you're talking about the teachers. And then she said, you're talking about all of us. And then she said, and you're talking about me, because I had that kind of experiences, those kinds of experiences when I was growing up. And if you had used a word like toxic stress to me, I never would have had the hope and the fortitude and the grit to try to recover. So I'm never going to use that word with the families with whom I work. And we immediately in Mind in the Making stopped using those words, and we talked about severe stress, because the reason that we made that change was because the assumption that adversity was destiny, that it was fatal. And that seemed to be a really important point. So the key point one is that adversity is not destiny, that that people are affected in different ways by experience, but just like the woman in that seminar, we can recover, and we shouldn't assume otherwise. I know in reading a lot of proposals by people, because the notion of toxic stress or trauma-informed care or ACEs sell, people like to do something to fix the problems, and rightly so, that children have. But so we have to counter this with the notion that this will get attention and get a reaction, but there's a downside to it, which is the assumption that adversity is destiny. The second point that I want to make is that stereotyping can seriously harm children. My understanding, my realization of how powerful this can be came not just from the literature, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the experience that I had. This was a funder meeting. that I went to about 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a presentation on ACEs. And when the speaker left the room, it was a group of both funders and researchers and community leaders. The community leaders went wild. They started to say, when you talk about ACEs in my community, people are making assumptions about children. They're assuming that if that child comes from a family where there's been a divorce, or they're assuming that if a child is growing up poor, that that child has experienced, has 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 ACEs. And we're creating what they worried about as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, the research is quite clear about this. If we believe something, it isn't just a belief that we can throw away. That frame, that perception that we have can color how we see people and how they feel about them. So words and the assumptions that they conjure up really do matter. So my worry about these concepts, as good as they are and as important contributions that they've made, is that if we keep talking about them in a negative framework, we're going to start stereotyping children. The third key point that I want to make is that people should not be defined by the experiences that they've had. I have a friend who has just been diagnosed with cancer, and that person is not going to tell anyone right now because that person doesn't want to be defined always, at least at this point, as a cancer survivor. The prognosis is extremely good for this person. So there's a universal feeling not to want to be defined by that experience. Sean Ginwright, who has written a beautiful article on this whole subject, talks about bringing together a group of African-American adolescent young people. And one of them had, all of them had experienced some form of trauma, ranging from sexual abuse, violence, homelessness, abandonment, or all of the above. But in one session, he was explaining the impact of stress and trauma on the brain development and how it can influence emotional health. As he was explaining this, one of the young men in the group abruptly stopped and he said, "I'm more than what's happened to me. I am not just my trauma." So again, I began looking for a more positive framework. So in moving along, we're going to go back to Bob with a new framework that can help unite what we're doing in very consciously dealing with the experiences that children have, but using a different lens, a different framework, a different perception, a different judgment in how we view these children and these families. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Ellen. I want to just ask you all to, as we look at the next slide, to hold in your mind a person you know who had adversity as a child, but has turned out to be okay. It could be someone you see in the mirror every morning. It could be someone you know. It could be someone you've heard about. But all of us can remember somebody who had adversity, but is okay, maybe even admirable. So people with 4 or more ACEs can be okay. From this, we know that other experiences also affect the brain, and we've begun to look at, do positive experiences affect brain development and resilience? Next slide, where we talk about healthy outcomes from positive experiences, we're using a broad definition of health from the World Health Organization, and they refer to health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So this definition is not new. And the positive experiences are not new either. Many of us know about attachment. The thing we need to learn in the first year of life is unconditional love that we learn from our parents. Conversation, literacy. As we grow older, and sometimes in 2-year-olds and often in 14-year-olds, that sense of independence and mastery, that I can do it too. All are incredibly important positive experiences that have been known for a long time. So as we looked at it, and this is, we decided to study positive childhood experiences just like ACEs. The ACEs was a survey that was done in 1990, and we published in 1998. People were asked about their childhood, and this was correlated with mental and physical health. What we did is we added questions to the 2015 Behavioral Risk Factors Survey in Wisconsin. they already included questions about ACEs, and we also asked questions about positive childhood experiences so we could study the effects of these childhood experiences on adult mental health. There were 7 types of positive experiences that we had that were included in this, as shown on the next slide. These results were published I'm sorry, I messed up the slide there. These results were published in JAMA Pediatrics, and it was one of the 10 most tweeted articles in 2019. So the 7 questions that were asked were: how often as a child did you feel able to talk to your family about feelings, that your family stood by you during difficult times? Did you enjoy participating in community traditions? Did you feel a sense of belonging in high school? Did you feel supported by your friends? How often did you have at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in you? And how often do you feel safe and protected? These were from an instrument called the CYRM28 by Dr. Unger, and we chose it because it was developed for the World Health Organization and has been used worldwide, so it's valid in people from many cultures. What we found was striking. Positive childhood experiences protect adult mental health. Compared to those with 0 to 2 positive childhood experiences, those with 6 or 7 experiences have a 72% lower odds of having depression or poor mental health. On the next slide, we can see that those who had an intermediate number, 3 to 5 positive childhood experiences, had a 50% lower odds of adult depression or poor mental health. Now, of course, individuals can have both positive childhood experiences and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. The next slide shows what happens when you look at them together. Oops. The top line here represents individuals who had 4 or more ACEs. So if they had 4 or more ACEs and no or 1 or 2 positive childhood experiences, 59.7% had depression or poor mental health. This went down to 21% or 20.7% among those who had 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences. Similarly, those with 3 to 5 positive childhood experiences dropped from slightly more than half to 16%. Those with 2 or 3 adverse childhood experiences went from 45 to 13, and those with no ACEs, the difference was in the right direction, but insignificant. From a technical point of view, what we talk about here is a dose response. The more positive childhood experiences, the more protection there is. Similarly, the more ACEs, the higher the likelihood of adult depression or poor mental health. But this result demonstrated that looking backwards, adults can recall positive childhood experiences that block the link between adverse childhood experience and the development of toxic stress, and block the link between toxic stress and physical outcomes. So to put it really directly, children can become resilient through positive childhood experiences so that affects them, that reduces the output of toxic stress when they experience adversity, and they can heal. Positive childhood experiences help people even if they've actually had toxic stress to heal. And what we know is that there's a biological mechanism of action that explains all of this. We now know in the 21st century that our brains continue to develop and change throughout life. We can recover from strokes. There are brain changes observed with positive experiences. And one of the things that I found the most interesting was that you can look at changes in adult brains when adults who are illiterate are taught to read. What happens is that they develop strong, fast connections between the visual cortex that processes sight and the portion of the brain that controls language. Similarly, when people go to a 2-week intensive meditation training program and then continue to meditate, you can see actual changes in their brain that last for at least 6 months. And, it's hard to look at post-traumatic brain growth in cases of child abuse or that sort of thing. But sometimes there are natural disasters which are traumatizing to a large population. What they saw in Japan was after an earthquake, there's something called post-traumatic brain growth. So the people grew different parts of their brain in recovery. And there are many people for whom a traumatic experience is a life-changing and transforming event. And there's a lot of indication and new understanding of how that works. On a cellular level, we know that the cells that produce the insulation around nerve fibers called myelin can be stimulated through experience and starved through lack of experience. These cells called oligodendrocytes can be stimulated to develop and change and grow by experience. There was recently a study of scientists in Antarctica, and I've never been there, but apparently if you're there during the winter, you tend to stay inside. And there's a pretty low level of stimulation when you're inside. Physically, it's all the same, and you have the same small group of people, and it's dark outside. And what we've been able to see is that for those people, their brains shrink a little in the winter and grow a little bit in the summer, which just goes to show that I'm a pediatrician. I think of kids all the time, but this brain plasticity is pronounced in children, but lasts through life, and that we know that positive experiences, whether it's recovering from bad things like a stroke or learning to meditate, can be seen in our brains. So going back to what Ellen said, adversity is not destiny, it's a setback, but our brains are equipped to reprogram. So we now think about 4 pillars of hope, which we're starting to call the 4 building blocks of hope. And up till now, I've been talking to you about how adults look backwards on their life and categorizing those positive childhood experiences. This figure comes from a report that Charlene Harper Brown from CSSP and I published in 2017. What we did is a literature review where we looked at programs and interventions that had been demonstrated to help children and adolescents. And we looked and saw what are the common elements, what are the experience that children have that may account for these positive outcomes from interventions. And we found 4 groups, the building blocks or pillars. The first one is relationships, and we've talked about that first foundational relationship we all have with our parents. As we grow up, we develop peer relationships, we develop relationships with other adults or mentors. And these happen through interaction. The second is safe, equitable, and stable opportunities to live, learn, and play. Some of the most profound information about this has come out of the movement towards creating positive school environments. Children who experience a positive school environment do better at school, have improved cognitive development, and better long-term outcomes. The next one was pretty interesting to me. You all are educators, you may have figured this out already, but engagement. That we need to develop a sense of connection, a sense that we matter, a sense that other people depend on us. So we developed materials for the American Academy of Pediatrics. I contracted with an after-school arts program called Artists for Humanity in Boston. And that's a place where about 200 Boston public school students do graphic arts on contract in the afternoon. They get paid, they're artists, and their outcomes are tremendous. There's not a social worker there. They're not looking at the deficits that led them to be struggling in school. They're looking at the fact that they're interested and capable in art, and that recognition flows through to other aspects of their life. And finally, opportunities for social and emotional development. This comes largely from playing and learning with peers. Robert Putnam had a recent book about American childhood, and what he talked about was that it's been a disaster that after-school programs now charge a fee. Some kids are excluded. Other kids don't have the opportunity to play with a diverse group of children and learn more about each other, because this is where social emotional learning most naturally and organically happens. So the 4 pillars of hope, or the building blocks, are one pattern. In California, Nadine Burke-Harris and the Office of the Surgeon General has suggested domains of interventions to prevent toxic stress. And these are designed for people who have had their ACEs score and know that they've suffered adversity. It's ways to help them scaffold their lives so that they won't experience toxic stress or will heal from it. And you can see that the language of hope really kind of matches the language of intervention. So we're talking about a preventive intervention strategy. The Surgeon General's office is talking about some of the same things: healthy relationships, sleep, exercise, nutrition, health, and mindfulness. It doesn't take very much to map these to things like relationships and social emotional learning, environmental factors. So, and the reason I show this slide is we don't think we have anything new. We think we're pulling together a language that allows us to communicate across sectors about those positive experiences and social assets that we have known for a long time are important, but we've lacked a common language to discuss them. The next slide shows the relationship between the language of hope and other programs you may have heard of. Hope looks at the child's own experience. Many people may be familiar with Strengthening Families, which also comes from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. This looks at the family level and defines 5 positive family assets that protect families and children. There are community level interventions. There preschool education is certainly one of them, and policy implications like paid family leave, which is promoted by the CDC's Essentials for Childhood program. We know, for example, that child abuse drops when there's paid family leave. So the next slide, I'm going to put you to work a little bit. What I want you to do is look at this next slide. There you go. Is look at this slide and identify in this slide any risks that you see. And please type them into the chat box. And I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. So look around at that picture and type in any risks you might see in this family. So I'm saying smoking, cleaning supplies left out, unclean house, inattentive parent, inadequate supplies, a mouse, paint falling off the walls, hot tea on the table, the baby is crying, there are rodents, the television's on. Okay, this is not a hard exercise. Now what I want you to do is take a big breath and think about it a different way. What are all the assets? What are the strengths that you see when you look at this picture? For most of us, well, I won't say anything else. Just going to ask you, Sarah, if you can type it in the box. Now we're going to switch. Food on the table, books, pets. Child has toys. Adults are reading. Multiple siblings in the same room. Mom has all the children in the room with her. The child is coloring. There's shelter, electricity. The child's in a safe environment in the playpen. They have a roof over their head. There's art, access to television, mom's reading, visual stimulation, the phone, which indicates she has connection to someone or something. For many people who have gone through training as doctors or social workers or intake workers, it's substantially harder to see strengths than to see risks. The difference between these two questions has nothing to do with the family. It all has to do with what happens between our own ears. This exercise is called cognitive reframing, and we need to train ourselves to do this. When I worked at Boston Medical Center, we had an outstanding obstetrics program for women who had opiate use disorder. So they received their obstetric care, and medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder during pregnancy, and afterwards, sometimes I would see their babies in my primary care practice. What I learned to do is before I knocked on the door for a new baby who was a graduate of this program, I reminded myself that this baby's mother made the decision to carry the baby to term, even though she herself or others may have told her not to because of her problem. She had gotten into or remained in recovery throughout her pregnancy, and she had fought with the Department of Children and Families to maintain custody. And by reminding myself of those things, I saw this mother as a person who was strong and resilient and persistent. And think about how true that is and how that fills out a picture that enables me to deal with a person with a serious problem like substance use disorder with a sense of empathy and admiration. And with that, I want to turn it back to Ellen to take over from there.
Thank you, Bob. The changes that we're talking about are not just language. We're talking about the way you see a situation and the way you talk about it. So continuing to use the notions of toxic stress or ACEs or trauma-informed care do frame the way we see it. We are suggesting a real change of language. When I realized that, I went to look for programs that worked in dealing with families that had had these kinds of experiences, and began to discover again and again and again that these programs built on family strengths. Bob's story of stopping for a moment and thinking about a parent before he saw her as thinking in positive ways made all of the difference, I'm sure, in the relationship that he could establish with her. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Alicia Lieberman. She has a program for families who have experienced trauma. It's called Attachment Vitamins. And when they first started the program, they noticed that the families came in and they were sitting, with their arms folded and looking, not looking very happy to be there and very distressed. And so they changed what they do, and they started by saying, tell us what you love about your child as the first introduction to the program. And then they build on that, and they looked further for moments of connection. So every week they would talk about asking the families, what was a wonderful moment of connection you had with your child, and then how can you have more of them? Again, think about how many teachers will only call a parent if there's a problem, and assume that that something is going on. And is there anything happening in your house? We've probably all as parents gotten those calls, and think about how it makes us feel. And we need to take that stance before we approach any family, to ask them what they love about their child, or the moments of connection, the moments when they're having a wonderful time, because good times multiply and a good attitude becomes prevalent. Another such program that I want to talk about is what Phil Fisher at the University of Oregon has done with his FIND program. What they've done is to videotape families with a cell phone, and then they go through the videotape and they look at what the families are doing. And in that tape, those moments, they always find one or two or three instances or more of families doing things that are really engaging the children, building on what's positive in the child's development, not criticizing, but being positive with the children. And so they show those to the families and then ask them again to go forth and do more. So we really need to change our stance if we're going to help families, by looking at what one of my colleagues calls positive opposites, asking people for what's right, or catch people doing something right, rather than always looking at what's wrong. I was rereading a book recently, Bob, by a colleague of yours at Tufts, Rich Lerner, and he talks about when talking to parents of teens. And if you just say, how's your child doing? Parents of teenagers will often say what the problems are rather than saying what's right with them. And that is not trivial. Those kinds of examples are not trivial. We really need to change, again, the way we see things and the way we talk about things. Now I'm going to go back to Bob after talking about building on children's and families' assets.
I just want to just say that this slide, Rosa Herrera asked a question that really got at this slide. So let's go through it. So one of the things we talk about is how to interact with adults with histories of trauma. And the case that here is Ms. S has been sober for 3 years. She went to a recent community event and she found out that her ACE score was 5. She mentions it to you, whatever your professional role is, and wonders how her own history will affect her 2-year-old son. So armed with the knowledge of positive childhood experiences, here are a few things that we can just draw from this 2-sentence story. First of all, she's been sober for 3 years. That's an accomplishment. So one of the things I would want to know is, how did she do it? What were her strengths? What were her supports? Because those things are important things that she'll be able to draw on with other challenges that come up in raising a child in life. The second thing is she was at a recent community event. So we know that she's engaged in her community. She got out of her apartment. She went somewhere with other people. Perhaps someone invited her along or not. And because of that, that was the thing that led her to you. But she came for help. And she wanted to know about it. She cared about this intergenerational transfer of adversity. There's a lot written about it and a lot talked about it. You can feel really optimistic because imagine her 2-year-old son has never experienced her mother actually using alcohol or having an active alcohol use problem. And the mother cares enough about the son that she's coming to get help because of her own history. So I'd want to know more about how she thinks her ACE score of 5 has affected her. Are there other problems? Does she have high blood pressure, which can go with adversity? Does she have trouble in some kind of relationship? And then work with her on those problems, knowing what a strong person she is and drawing from those strengths that she had that allowed her to stay sober for so long. So if you look at this from a positive childhood experience lens, it's not very difficult to begin to work with her to identify ways to break the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And because of our knowledge.
I'm going to just jump in for a second. I would assume that this is not neglecting the fact that she's had these experiences. Being positive isn't being Pollyannish.
Oh, no, not at all. So one of the things I said is her ACE score is 5, so I want to know how has that affected her? And some of it may be things like blood pressure or depression, and it may just be an open question on how it's affected her, what she thinks it's done to her. So you don't want to ignore it, but you also don't want to say, that's her. You're a 5. Ellen, thank you for asking. I kind of skipped over that.
I see we have questions like that in the question and answer box. Go
Sure.
ahead.
So finally, what we're working towards is a sense of what hope-informed care looks like. So we want to start by acknowledging childhood memories. So ACEs acknowledges childhood memories. Lots of things do. Since we've been talking about Alicia Lieberman, she very famously wrote about angels in the nursery. So there are things that happen to us as a child, good and bad. As Ellen mentioned, history of adversity or adversity is not destiny. That we know from brain science that we have the ability to be resilient and to heal. And part of healing often is getting help. And sometimes help is a professional help. Sometimes help may be by getting involved with the spiritual organization, with your neighbors, with something else, with your family. But few of us can go through life without help. And certainly if you're doing that, and all of us need to invent better ways to parent. So I think my parents were pretty good. And I often thought about them when I was raising my own kids, for better or worse. But when my kids grew up and they started having cell phones and using the internet, I had no way of going back to my own childhood to know what to do. And so I'm an immigrant from the 20th century to the 21st century. Many of our families are immigrants in other ways. And all of us have to reinvent how we parent. So the fact that we had troubling childhoods is one more thing to reinvent. We need to deal with it, acknowledge it, handle the problems that flow from it. But it's also important to understand that it's not destiny, and we can thoughtfully and mindfully raise our children differently. So going back to Ellen for a second, you want to just summarize where we are?
Well, we're going to go back and forth on this. So why don't you start with talking about reframing, and I'll talk about the second one.
Okay. So reframing is that exercise that I did and what I told you about. When you have an initial encounter with a person, the reframe is looking for not just what happened to you, but what went right for you, and what can we learn from that?
In the Mind in the Making modules, we give people an exercise often when we ask them to describe something that was very stressful. And then we ask them to think about how they took on that challenge. And that reframed it for them, because when they think about it as being stressful, they often think about not being able to cope very well. But when they think about it in terms of how did I take on that challenge, what did I do to cope, that worked very well. The second point that Bob and I want to make is listen for the positives and look for the positives. See what people are doing right, not just what they're doing wrong. It's so easy to criticize. It's so easy to look for what's wrong, but look for the good things and talk about those, build on those. We at the Bezos Family Foundation developed a curriculum for pediatricians in training, residents, and throughout the training that we've done, it's called Keystones of Development, and it's free online. Throughout that training, we showed examples of pediatricians in well-child visits, finding things that the parents were doing right and talking about them as a way of trying to shift us into more of an asset-informed approach, away from a negative sort of approach. So those two, listen for the positive and build on what people are doing right, I think are good strategies.
We can also create opportunities for social connection. So whether it's through informal activities for the children, parent-child activities, where you can make that. Many of the children's trust funds around the country are doing parent cafes where parents get together to talk about that. You know, one of the things that we know is that parenting is stressful, and being able to lean on each other really is a key to success. You know, in the old days, before I was born, we lived in villages and clans and extended families. And then we had the nuclear family, and now we have the subatomic family. And it's hard, and it's lonely. And I think that makes it very difficult to do the other things that we have. So I've seen in my practice, and you probably have seen where you work, that successful families have a network of friends and relatives who help them, and we can encourage people to do that. And that's one kind of action that we can help people take. And so I think that when you listen to what people are doing right, how they've conquered past challenges, you can use that to help catalyze them into taking action to deal with whatever challenges they're facing now, and not consider it as their destiny and there's nothing else to do.
When we look at the literature on stress, it's almost like a triangle with support and reframing, and then taking action. That's sort of the iron triangle of how one copes positively with stress and takes on challenges. And a part of that is celebrating successes, setting goals for yourself, helping people set goals for themselves, not setting goals for them, because we can't really change other people. We can only invite people to set goals for themselves of things that they want to change in their own lives, and then celebrating those. I think here of the research of Gabrielle Oettingen and her WHOOP measure that we often use. WHOOP means wish. What is it you wish for yourself if you want to make a change? What are the outcomes if you make that change in yourself? not someone else, not my husband, not my kids, not the people I work with, but in myself. What are the outcomes that I'll feel if I make that change? That's the O of WO. And then what are the obstacles? What will stand in the way of my making that change? And then developing a plan, an if-then plan. So if that obstacle occurs, then I will do. So that is a very good strategy for helping people set a goal and then succeed in it. And when they do, I think it's really important for all of us to celebrate. We celebrate ourselves and celebrate each other when we achieve a goal that we've had and making a change in our own lives. Back to you, Bob.
You know, at this point, I want to just take a moment and listen to what Sarah Welch has to say.
Hi, this is great. Thanks for letting me step in and just provide a perspective on this, because I think a lot of this research and information has come at the perfect time for us to rethink where we are with even just talking about ACEs in the state of Iowa. So I'm involved more from the communications and outreach end of the work, and really working with communities on how do we talk about this with communities, with providers, with educators. And for us, this is a really nice reframe of how we have the conversation. I think what's really gelled for me is really that focus on having the strengths within ourselves, within our families, and even within our communities that we can build on. And it's really fitting with some of the conversations I've been having with individuals who are providing services in our community, saying that the conversation has really shifted from, with the first ACE study, it was, going from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And now I think we're having a lot more conversations about how can we respond, that it doesn't even matter to ask the question, what happened to you, whether someone has trauma or not, you can manage that in a more supportive environment. And really it's how are we responding to one another so we all have that opportunity to thrive. It also sort of reminds me, I come from the child abuse prevention field, and when the ACE study came out, it felt like we went a little bit back towards, here's really the shocking factor of how much trauma is in our community and the real significant impact that can have. And I think from a communications perspective, that felt like it created a lot of shock and the sense of, oh, wow, this is such a huge problem. What could we possibly do about it? And I think this conversation of bringing hope back into the conversation and really starting with solutions and the things that we know we can do in our communities, that it's bringing back that piece of how we can all engage in this effort and be a part of it. I think, when we look locally here, we've had a lot of focus on the looking at the way to respond to ACEs is to have that supportive, caring relationships, and that is the biggest piece for responding. But I also appreciate that this conversation says, yes, relationships are important and a key ingredient, but also we need to think about the environments in which kids are being raised. We need to think about their engagement with our community, and also just the skills that they need to be building in their lives that will help them thrive. So really, how are we surrounding families and children and building that well-being through multiple pieces? I would also just add that this conversation is helping me rethink how we tell stories about ACEs. So when we did the original ACEs report, and as we've told stories, we've really focused heavily on capturing people, telling sort of that perfect story arc of here's their trauma, here's what they experienced. Through some service that came in, they were able to overcome that difficulty and thrive. And I think this conversation and some of the other conversations we've been having is helping us think through how do we tell more stories about changes within our culture, within our organizations, and stories about place in our neighborhoods and what it looks like for multiple players to come in and change the environment for everyone to thrive. So it's no longer these stories of, here's this huge obstacle we had to overcome, but more here's what our communities can look like when we respond. So I think too, I've heard from a lot of people locally here that they no longer, with this kind of framework, they're no longer seeking out disclosure of trauma, or they're no longer asking people to share their ACE scores, but what they're asking instead is that we're creating an environment of safety, trust, and compassion. And if those stories come out, it is now an environment that can be more supportive and have that wraparound support that somebody needs to talk about it and to heal. But really, it's more about what do we need in our environment to help everybody who comes to this place thrive. And so I'm excited about all of this conversation, because I think for us, as we start our next Iowa ACEs report, it's getting us to reshift the focus back to the solutions up front. And it's also helping us think about, the other thing we're in the middle of is the session at the Iowa legislature. And a lot of elected officials are coming to us saying, what's the ACEs strategy? How do we stop the trauma? And now our message is becoming much more focused around, well, it's really about prevention and early intervention, and what are the supports that we need to be building in our communities for families and children to thrive. So all of this just really fits in with some of the conversations we've been having locally, and we're in the process of gathering our own resiliency data as well. We're really hoping we can showcase that in the next report. It just, a lot of it's based on the same questions from Wisconsin. And so we really hope that that can actually be the starting data we focus on in the next report, but we'll see what we get as results.
Sarah, I think that is so inspiring, and I hope other communities are also going to take a framework where they move toward looking at prevention and intervention, and the fact that we need to deal with these issues, but not to stereotype or not to label. In fact, some states have even changed the language that they use. Rather than talking about ACEs, they're using healing-centered. Acid-informed were the words that I thought of. So now, all three of us, Bob, Sarah, and I, would love to hear from you all, both in terms of your questions, put them in the Q&A box, or put them in, but let us know either examples that you have of what you're doing that other people could learn from, or questions that you might have of any of the three of us.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to Bob and Sarah as well for these great presentations and for this really kind of powerful reframing of this work around supporting families that are experiencing adversity, and really focusing on the resilience and the hope and the strengths, the assets that they're bringing to their lives and supporting their children. We've gotten a number of great questions in the Q&A box, and so I'd like to share those back with you. One is from Rosa Herrera, who's asking, how can we help break intergenerational trauma? How can we help support parents in healing from traumas and understanding the triggers, and thus reduce the trauma that their children would be experiencing? And so I don't know if you'd like to start with that, Dr. Sege?
Sure. I think that it sort of comes directly out of what we've been talking about today, is first of all, to help the parents understand that their own past experience of trauma doesn't necessarily automatically transmit to the children, and that they can reinvent parenting, and give them that sense of hope and understanding. The second is that to the extent that they're triggering or otherwise suffering from the effects of trauma, to have help directed at those. So they may need cognitive behavioral therapy. They may have symptoms that are just because in addition to their own trauma, they've become socially isolated, and becoming more active in their community, or their church, synagogue, or mosque may be helpful. But to really work with them to understand what are the problems that they're having as a result of the trauma, because frankly, you can't undo the past. What we know about brain development and brain plasticity is having a series of positive experiences and structures that allow us to have that, allows us to realize that we're actually okay and we're not inevitably damaged. So it may be therapy for some people, it may be engagement for others, but to really take on those problems and to make sure that they understand that it's not just what happened to them isn't destiny for their children.
Any anything that you would like to add, Ellen or Sarah Welsh?
There are programs in communities. I'm thinking of, again, back to Alicia Lieberman's attachment vitamins, which she's now has online, which help people recover from, in a group setting, help people recover and find the angels in the nursery versus the ghosts in their nurseries. And then, Bob, you probably have other resources that you'd like to share.
Sure. So what I'd like to do is suggest people go to positiveexperience.org. That has a bunch of new resources. In addition, the CDC has Essentials for Parenting and Essentials for Childhood with a great deal of resources. And of course, I'm a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and we have a website called childhealth.org. And that has really a lot of information for parents about specific issues ranging from effective discipline to raise healthy children to things about ADHD and the effects of trauma and all of those things. And the final resource is to remember that pediatricians are all trained in child development, and many of us are also connected in some way with community resources. And there are, it's often difficult for families to find what they need on their own, but the health clinic may be able to help them find those and make those connections they need.
And people have asked whether these, who may have signed on late, have asked whether these slides will be available for them, and they will be. Sarah, do you want to explain that again, please?
Yes, happy to do so. And I will post, I posted a link to the slides at the beginning of the webinar, and I will post that again in the chat box right now. But everyone who registered for today's conversation will be receiving a follow-up email, which will come out early next week, which will include not only the slide deck, but also a link to the recording so that you can watch this conversation again, share it with your friends and colleagues in this work. And it will also include links to a lot of these resources that all of our presenters and our commentator are referencing in this conversation. So it will be a very robust and rich resource that you'll be receiving in your inbox either Monday or Tuesday of next week. Yeah. But the link to the slides is right there in the chat box as well.
I just want to call out another resource. Sammy Peterson wrote a really nice interpretation of the 4 pillars of hope that I would encourage people to look at. It's taught me a few things.
And we will put those in the resources that are sent out next week. We'll have links to all of the resources that we have mentioned. And we would also love to hear from you. Sarah has done a fabulous job of explaining what she's doing in Iowa, but anyone else around the country who is doing great things, please share them with us, because we will all pass them on.
Speaking of the 4 pillars, we have a question from Sammy Peterson. It was actually in the chat box that I'd love to share. So wondering if it's possible to have examples of how the 4 pillars look in service-focused agencies and organizations. So in terms of thinking about the relationships, changing how we interact with clients as they might come in. She's suggesting possibly instead of saying interviewing, is there different language? For the 2nd pillar, making your time with the client playful and learning focused. And then for the 3rd, giving them a voice in the process. We're asking them to do with us versus telling them what they have to do. Knowing about local social civic activities we can refer families to in the communities. Any thoughts about ways that people can respond to that?
I really love Sammy's examples. Thank you. You know, one of the things that we're working on in medicine is for too often the first thing that happens when you show up is you get a clipboard with pages and pages of questions about all of your problems and some things that may be shameful. We're trying to replace that with questions about about some of these positive assets. So the relationship that we model, I think that also moves beyond the personal, and that for backing up relationships, one of the strongest recent examples has been the state-by-state adoption of paid parental leave, because we know that foundational relationship in the first year of life is extraordinarily important. And families that are low-income families and don't have a lot of money in the bank are unable often to take advantage of the of family and medical leave unless they're also paid. And what we've seen is in California and other states that policy change promotes attachment. So it's important to think about it in the at the individual interpersonal level, at the service level, where we're service providers, but also at the policy level. For me, some of the strongest aspects that go into the building block of the environment are the social environment in which we live. So making sure that playgrounds are clean, free of needles, safe places for kids to go and play. That's an environmental aspect. Positive school environments so that children feel a sense of belonging and feel valued and treasured when they go to school. And we know that that feeling is an important predictor of adult success, and it's different than how they do academically. Obviously, they're related, but they're a different sort of thing. So providing those environments is important, and I think that in Sammy's comment, she also talked about the environments that we provide as service providers. The sense of engagement and mattering, I personally believe in a shared decision-making model for medical care. So that level of engagement is important. Other things are in the classroom, when children take on classroom tasks that are important, that other people depend on them, that are age appropriate, whether it's cleaning the bulletin boards or all kinds of things that people do so that children have that sense that they matter to their communities. For teenagers, when they can volunteer or work in their communities and see the results of what they do, whether it's that a crowd gathers for their basketball game or concert, or they produce graphic arts that are everywhere, or they volunteer in a nursing home, or in a cleanup project, or this time of year, going door to door for political candidates, that sense of engagement is an enormously powerful sense for each of us, starting very young, to help promote our development and promote resilience and healing. And finally, for the social emotional learning, there are specific therapeutic or remedial things that you might do, but most of the evidence says that social emotional learning comes through informal child-directed play. And how do we as adults create an atmosphere? I mentioned earlier the problem of fees for after-school programs, but how do we create an atmosphere that promotes that social emotional development? One school I visited, they had a social worker who came by, I don't know how often, but she rotated through the classrooms after recess, and she asked the kids to talk about what happened at recess. And I have to believe that that intervention helped the children understand the social emotional learning that happened through their child-directed play. Those are a few examples. You all probably have a million examples. What I found is once you start thinking about it this way, some of the programs and policies and practices that we all do easily fit into this framework.
This is very in line with the discussion that the leadership team had at the Bezos Family Foundation yesterday. We're in a series of mini retreats when we're looking at both what our value added is and what we need to do in the world moving forward. And we based it on looking at the developmental needs of children and making sure that we were meeting, that we were funding or creating materials to promote the developmental needs of children to belong, that is, to feel connected and supported by other people is a key need throughout the lifespan, not just for kids, but for adults, but beginning in infancy with attachment and going forward. To have some say or some autonomy, some agency, some feeling that you have some choices over your life, that really is critically important, so that you're respected and that you have some sort of say. A third bucket full of developmental needs that we looked at were feeling competent. So pointing out what people were doing right and building on the skills and abilities. That doesn't mean not challenging people, but building on their skills and abilities. And finally, helping people find a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, so that they can become people who contribute back to the world, meeting those for major developmental needs, and then helping people have skills in what they're going to do moving forward. And one of the key skills that I think is taking on challenges. So rather than resilience or coping, I've always framed it as the ability to take on challenges and try hard things. And that's something that we need to work on as adults, and that's something that we need to give to children. So this discussion is very apropos of the way we're thinking about our work. Yes, words do matter, and the concepts behind them do matter, and we're trying to work hard to make that reframe what we're doing and make that make a more science to action framework in going forward. I noticed that Joe Robertson said we're experiencing a distressing amount of violence in Kansas City out of conflicts. Is there any advice in reframing this or using this asset-formed approach for schools and after-schools program in addressing violence? Bob, why don't you start, and then I have some things to say there too.
Yeah, the answer is yes, and the details are more complicated. In Boston, we had an epidemic of youth violence in the 90s, and one of the ways it was dealt with was through outreach workers. And in general, the concept of a positive youth development, which has been promoted by the National Academy of Sciences, really talks about bringing young people in to help solve some of the issues that are going on. It's slow work, it's difficult, but it can be done. And what we know specifically are having opportunities available for kids to have safe places to be after school, to have opportunities for growth and development so that they don't need to fill their sense of mastery and belonging by joining a gang, but there are other ways to do that seem to work. That it requires a really multi-sector involvement. In Boston, one of the most powerful things that happened were ministers went out in the streets at night and talked with the kids. There was a lot of work from what was called the 10-Point Coalition of churches who worked along with the police to reduce violence. And finally, there are some kids who are really quite threatening, and they need to be dealt with in some way so that it provides a safer environment. And just the final thing, and I don't really want to veer into the political, but we know that when guns are available and there's a high rate of gun ownership, that youth violence can turn lethal, and the stakes go so much higher. So one of the other things that it has been going on is reducing the access of children and youth to firearms is an effective way to reduce lethal youth violence.
Several years ago, I did a study that asked young people that question. How much violence they had experienced, what kind of violence, and what would they do to improve the violence in their lives. And what the kids told in this, we did a study in one state where there was a particular, like in Kansas City, a lot of violence going on at the moment. And then we did a nationally representative study. It's one of the studies, I'm doing a study right now, the 5th study in this series, where we ask young people, youth voices studies, where we ask them what they would do. So the first thing that young people said was, it's the small things that lead to the big things. So don't just focus on the bullying or the more extreme violence. Focus on the picking on, teasing, making fun of, the small acts of being mean to other people, in a sense. And the second thing that young people said, and I think this is so critical, so I would give this as advice, Joe, is that if we're the problem, then we have to be part of the solution. And so I would bring together young people in your schools who are seen as leaders, but who are respected across the spectrum, and ask them to come up with a plan, one thing that they could do to reduce the violence. Maybe it's an ad campaign. Have the newspapers write about it. Let the young people be on television because people love attention. But have them come up with, school by school, a plan. Now, teachers may say, we don't have time for that. We're so busy. We have all these tests that we have to do and that sort of thing. But think about how much time the bullying or the other things that happen on the internet at night take the teachers every morning. I think if you did something like this and made it as a kind of a project in giving back, it would really make a huge difference. It's something that I've always wanted to do after that study, because I think young people will show that they can be part of the solution. It's not just adults having to solve it for them, but give young people the skills and the opportunity to take on these issues for themselves. I think beginning in grade school, middle school. I know that a lot of our focus is early childhood, but if there's violence in the schools with young people, I think that they can do it as they can be part of the solution as well. So with Mind in the Making, as we're developing an online curriculum, we're showing teachers and families all kinds of ways that kids can begin to solve problems for themselves and not just have adults fix them for them. So I think that it's part of a reinvention of the way we deal with social issues in our country, is to have children as age appropriate become part of the solutions.
I love that. That's a great point, Ellen, and wonderful way to engage them in solving the problems. I wanted to point out that I've just launched the quick survey poll that we would love it if all attendees could take just a moment to respond to. And then I also, while you're doing that, I wanted to share another question that we had from Kathy Kinsner that's asking about, you know, in looking at the impact of both ACEs and positive childhood experiences together, what about children who have few ACEs but also have few positive childhood experiences? Was there any data in your study with regards to that, Bob?
Yeah, so there was data, and if they have no positive childhood experiences, whatever level of ACEs they have, they're more likely to have poor mental health and depression. And so I'm just pulling out the graph right now. There you go. So what you can see is the kids who had only one ACE, but only 0 to 2 positive childhood experiences, 45% of them had depression or poor mental health, which is substantially higher than people who had more ACEs and more positive childhood experiences. So children need those key developmental needs that Ellen just listed that from their retreats yesterday, as well as needing to be protected from adversity. And it's a combination of both. And I think that as some of the comments are going on, it's really clear that if we want to promote child development, we need to look at both aspects of it so we can create environments for children to have those experiences.
I want to say one thing before we go back to the questions, which is that it was part of Ralph Smith's and my dream in creating this Science Matters series that we know we've asked you to come together in communities to listen. And we hope that you will turn to the people in your communities either now or when this is over, and think about one thing that you could do to make the kind of change that you would like to see in your own communities. These were not meant to be passive listening or even question and answer kinds of experiences. These were meant to draw on the wisdom that you have in the way that Sarah Welsh just shared the wisdom that she has and her team has from Iowa.
Do we have enough time, Sarah Torian, to show the slide called After Today?
Sure. Is that going back to a slide that was in the deck initially?
Yep.
Okay.
Otherwise, I stopped the slides, so I wanted to make sure we had time to hear from Sarah Welch when we went to the discussion. There you go. So what you can do, if you're watching, picking up on what Ellen just said, is write yourself a note. This was for a postcard, but forget about the postcard. And write something that you're going to do in the next 2 weeks that you'll bring back to your work. And our suggestion is you write something that's called a SMART aim. It's something specific, something that you can measure and know that you did it, something you can actually do, something that's relevant to your work, and time-bound. So time-bound just means, for example, in the next 2 weeks, something specific, I'll review our data. Many programs generate data and look at where there are gaps in the knowledge of positive experiences. So we've seen a few comments that we should be working with preschool teachers or this group or that group, but write yourself a note about something that might be you like to do in the next couple of weeks. If you like, you can share it in the chat box. If it's just private for yourself, that's okay too. But I think that one thing that's really helpful is just promising ourselves that we'll take what we've learned and do something different in our work with it.
Bob, Portia Kennel asked you a question, which is, what is the prevalence in the study of the number of children who had no positive childhood experiences?
You know, I don't know off the top of my head. The reference is from JAMA Pediatrics in September 2019. It's also available on the positiveexperience.org website.
And maybe we could share it afterwards.
Yep.
We will do that.
Yeah, Portia has been a leader in creating Educare in Chicago, and I
Yep.
just...
It's an excellent question. I just don't want to make up a number. Well, it's tempting.
Appreciate it.
So Maureen O'Brien is asking a question, or actually making more of a comment, it seems, but as a field, we need to elevate the voice and importance of parents as the foundational relationships for kids' well-being. It is just not appreciated from a strengths-based perspective. Everyone understands risks, but not everyone understands strengths. So you all have done so much to kind of move this forward already. Is there any advice or thoughts that you could share about how to continue moving this work forward for those in the campaign network?
Well, I'll start and say that for many years, I studied the relationship between parents and professionals. And what I found is that there could be an attitude, I came to call it parentist, because if it were age or race or gender, you would call it ageist or racist or sexist, where professionals really put down parents. And I think we do it for a reason. I don't think it's just that we as professionals are evil. I think that as we start to get attached to the children, it becomes hard to share the care of children. Barry Brazelton always often talked about that as well. So it's easier to see someone else, if the child is having trouble, someone else did it, versus looking at what the strengths of parents are. So I think first we have to be aware of when we have an attitude that I might call parentist, and look at the strengths in the way that Bob talked about when the patient came into the room or the parent came into the room, and just looking at the strengths of those parents. Then I think words matter. Sandra was talking in the chat box about language matters, changing the narrative. I think I would really never ask what is going on at your house as a way of talking about a child, or particularly calling up about a child is the first thing with what, as a teacher, is saying what's wrong. But sharing what the child is doing that's wonderful and well. And then a teacher could say, we have an issue, and I'd love your ideas on how we might solve this issue together. But that's in the context of a place where the parent feels respected and supported, and not that she or he is going to be attacked. I think joint problem solving among parents and professionals is really good. Parents will have techniques that they've tried that will work, rather than the teacher trying to fix it for the parent. We tend to have an understandable tendency to want to fix it for other people, but we're better off in building the problem-solving capacities of others. Where we join in, we're not just standing back and letting anything happen, but we're also building on the strengths of other people.
And just to add to that, we may have resources or connections that are helpful, but they're not helpful unless the parent wants them and feels okay about accessing them and understands why their life might be better. I also think that there are really simple ways to do some of this. So one thing is to ask a parent how they chose the child's first name, which often gets a little story about their culture and their background and their family. It's a way to open up a whole lot of other discussions. I love what Ellen said about starting with appreciation for what the child brings to the picture, and also sometimes ask the parents if they see that behavior at home. And the behaviors at school and home are often different for a variety of reasons. So there are ways to think about this. But because, and the final thing I want to say, which we're struggling with in medicine, is that all of the various services and resources in most of our communities are pretty scattered and pretty hard to get information about. So to the extent that we can be a hub of places that can help parents, it's really worthwhile.
Well, we are right at the end of our time together, so I would just like to say a heartfelt thank you to our two panelists and our commentator today, Ellen Galinsky, Dr. Robert Sege, and Sarah Welch. From the comments in the chat box, comments in the Q&A box, and emails that we got before this conversation, it is clear that your presentation has been really kind of moving and is really hitting folks where they want to be hit. It's going to be inspiring a lot of great work. So thank you for joining us today. And to those of you in the Campaigns Network, we invite you to continue joining in for more of these conversations. You can see on the screen 3 that we've got coming up in the next few weeks. So I hope you will continue to save this date and time and join in for more of these learning conversations. Thank you so much to all who joined in today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. And thanks again for inviting us.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness.